Welcome back to the 1600 game. We're going to do a solo session today because all my tutors are busy enjoying themselves on beaches and mountains for spring break. This one goes out particularly to a friend of mine who will remain unnamed, but my homie in the Berkshires, you know who you are. We're going to go over some questions that you sent me. These questions will be relevant to anybody watching the video because our unnamed friend in the Berkshires is quite smart, and these are some difficult questions that he encountered when going through a practice test. So let's jump into some of these questions, and we may even address some of the notes that our anonymous, hardworking, brilliant student has put in this document so we can understand a little deeper what it's like to study on your own. A lot of the strategies that we discuss in the 1600 game, both in our app and in this set of videos and podcasts, a lot of these strategies are really important, but there is a really important fact, which is if you know a strategy and you don't know how to employ it correctly, you can run into difficulties. Said a different way, a little learning is a dangerous thing. So we're going to go one step beyond some of the strategies and understand how to deploy the strategies correctly so that when you're faced with a question on the test, you see the strategy you should use and some of the things that could go wrong if it's misused. So let's jump right in. We're going to start with this question here from practice test 5. It says here, number 2, we have a words in context question. Okay, so this type of question, we have a couple of strategies to consider. The most important one is to not just look for the right answer based on the normal meaning of the word. What you really want to do is make sure that you are breaking this down into pieces. First, you want to read the text, of course. Then you want to come up with your own word or phrase. And if that's difficult, you should start by finding a clue in the sentence and then come up with your own word or phrase. So let's do that here. I'll start reading the passage, and then afterwards, I'll propose a word or phrase, and then we'll use that to eliminate answer choices. To demonstrate that the integrity of underground metal pipes can be assessed without unearthing the pipes, engineer Aroba Salim and colleagues blank the tendency of some metals' internal magnetic fields to alter under stress. The team showed that such alterations can be measured from a distance and can reveal concentrations of stress in the pipes. Okay, so this may be a word that you don't recognize as important right away, but maybe the most important word here structurally is this word such. Okay, so the word such is pointing backwards, which alterations, the alterations that have been mentioned previously in the text. So let's find that. We'll underline it. It says, yes, they alter under stress, right? So these stressed out pipes, we can measure something based on that stress, right? So I'm going to put my own phrase in here. They're going to use, let's just say that seems like a fairly anodyne phrase. They can use the tendency of these metals. Okay, so we want an answer that means used. And most importantly, any answer that is far afield from used, we're going to get rid of. If something is in the ballpark, let's keep it. But if it's far away from the word used, we'll get rid of it. So hypothesized. This is a classic trap, and I want you to be aware of the tendencies of the test makers to make great traps. So the reason this is a trap is because we're talking about science, right? So don't be duped into thinking that if a word reminds you of the context that it's right. In fact, if you're in module 2, which is difficult, then you should probably get rid of this answer. This is what I call test awareness broadly on the test. Know where you are and know what applies based on where you are. So module 2, the questions should be more difficult, particularly if you've done a good job in module 1. Okay, well then they're going to be trying to mess with students. And if it's about science, the word hypothesize is a great trap. Doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong, but it means it's a very low probability answer. In this case, we had the word used as our, sort of filler word, and hypothesized does not mean used. Does used mean discounted? Well, I mean, I suppose you could make the claim that something that is used when you purchase it might be discounted from the full price. But I think most of us would say that the word used does not mean the same thing as discounted, right? And the same thing with redefined. Redefined does not mean used. So this brings us to the right answer, D. And it also brings us to something I said at the beginning, which is the basic sort of common usage of a word is not necessarily the usage that will be applied on the test, right? So when most people think of exploited, they might think of used, but they think about it in a very specific way, right? If somebody is exploiting somebody else, they're taking advantage of someone. That's not, that's a negative thing, right? And here used is meant more neutrally, like they just utilized something, right? But the word exploited does have that general meaning. And most importantly, if you're disciplined, you might be pushed into picking that answer if you think twice about the general meaning of the word exploited and the fact that the other answer choices don't really fit, okay? So process of elimination is a serious strategy. I know that we've all heard of process of elimination, but it's a serious and almost technical strategy that you can apply on the SAT. So by that, I mean to say, if you have some steps prior to making an answer choice locked in, and those steps were read to find a clue. You saw where I underlined clues. Pick your own word or phrase, and then be disciplined about getting rid of words that are far afield from the word that you've picked. With that, you might end up picking exploited because you know that it kind of means the same thing as used, even though it wasn't the kind of word that you would have picked on your own. Okay, so strategy in the place of intuition can make a huge difference on these vocabulary questions. And indeed, the right answer is D. Notice our very smart friend picked A, right? So for my friend in the Berkshires, keep in mind what we said about the word hypothesized. It's a trap, and it's based on the theme of the question. Let's move on to the next one here. Our next question, I'm actually going to skip for now, and I'm going to go to a different strategy so that we cover as much as possible here. We have a few of these vocabulary ones. If we have time, we'll come back to them. And what I want to get to right away is some of the low-hanging fruit. So that brings me to an important point. In the 1600 game, the app that I've developed, we have the Mastermind AI system, which is based on 10,000 hours of my tutoring, which is kind of insane. But there it is. I've been recording my meetings for years and years now, and we've used that in our system to understand the best way to teach the SAT, to teach basically the fanciest version of an AI system, precisely how I think about the questions. So we haven't made that AI smarter, but we have made it much more focused on the game of the SAT and understanding the game that we're playing. So one of the things that Mastermind does is build a study plan for you. And there may be parts of the test that you think you want to work on because they're hard. Maybe you're an ambitious, motivated person and you want to get right to the good stuff. You want to do something hard. It's really important that you take advantage of the low-hanging fruit. That is, the questions that are easiest to get right as opposed to going right to the hard stuff. So anytime someone says the word just, they say, oh, it's just a silly mistake. Or, oh, don't worry about that one. I just messed up there. As a tutor, I pay attention to that. That is the spot where the student should really focus. That just is the low-hanging fruit. Just a silly mistake actually means that there's something about your process that was prohibiting you from getting all of your points on the test. So this type of question here, this number 18, you might consider a low-hanging fruit. It's punctuation rules. However, there's some strategies to keep in mind here, strategies you should employ, and also strategies that you want to be aware of that the test makers employed to create a trap. So let's get into it. On this question, we never start with the question itself. We always start with the answer choices. So we notice here that we have a comma, we have nothing at all, we have looks like I think a semicolon. I'm going to zoom in and just double check. And then we have just the word and. Let me confirm that that's a semicolon and not a colon before we say anything else. Yeah, that's a semicolon. Okay, so we have some options here. The first thing you should know about punctuation questions is that you always start with the strongest answer first. That's not because it's most likely to be correct. That's because it's the easiest to evaluate. So our strongest punctuation here is a semicolon. In almost all cases, a semicolon is used basically in the exact same way that a period is used to separate two full sentences. And I learned the strategy I'm about to show you actually from a student. It's an important phrase from Robert Heinlein: when one teaches, two learn. So when I was teaching this question to another student, I also learned. And what did I learn? Well, I learned that if you assess from after the punctuation first, you can usually make a decision that simply. So do we have a full sentence starting with wax paper? Well, we have a couple of commas that are probably worth paying attention to, so let me mark those. We have a comma after the word paper, and we have a comma after the word translucent. Most of the time, two commas could be treated like a set of parentheses. It's at least a safe bet to begin with. So can we read around that set of commas and see if we have a full sentence? If you'll recall, my strategy for seeing if something is a full sentence is, hey, guess what? So I'll try this. If it feels like I've completed a sentence, if I've told you something in full, then you'll know it's a full sentence. Hey, guess what? Wax paper allows only some light to pass through. Feels like a sentence. I've told you something, random as it may be. So that's a full sentence. Of course, if you want to check to make sure that this is the right answer, you probably should go see if the if the stuff prior to the semicolon is a full sentence. And I think it is. We have one right at the beginning of the sentence. It says, physical materials can be classified by how much light passes through them. Oh, there's a period. Let's read afterwards. Clear glass, comma, allows all light to pass through. That is a full sentence. So I could say, hey, guess what? Clear glass allows all light to pass through. Two full sentences, and for that reason, the semicolon is appropriate. Now, I could imagine a very smart and critical listener, viewer, saying, why should I start with the second half if you ended up going and looking at the first half anyways? Why did you assess after the punctuation as opposed to before the punctuation? It's a good question. The answer to it is maybe not so simple, but I'll describe it. Psychologically, as we read from the beginning of the sentence, we're likely to make assumptions as we go. So for many people, if you start at the beginning of the sentence and you read through the point in question before the word wax paper, you might start to think that a comma would make perfect sense here. And perhaps it would, right? The determining fact was, is the second sentence complete? Because the second sentence was complete, we could retroactively say that we needed stronger punctuation. So by flipping this around and starting with the second half of the sentence, we're overriding the psychological tendency to make an assumption at that spot, right? We've overridden that tendency to decide before we've continued or before we've finished the sentence, right? Another way of thinking about this is we all run out of steam at a certain point. We all have a limited amount of endurance. So our intellectual endurance runs lower the longer that we have to apply focus. So by breaking it into pieces and by starting with the end, we're more likely to be paying close attention to that critical aspect of the question. So there we have it. That was a punctuation question. Let's see what else our friend in the Berkshires of Massachusetts is wondering about. Okay. So I'm going to read this student's note here because I think it was really useful to think about. We're going to look at a verb question. And the student says they used type 1 verb trick to weed out C, but double checked with the passage and the quote idea is singular. So they picked A. So let's see what they're talking about. The first thing to notice is, we've been asked about the conventions of standard English. and we have answer choices that are simply verbs. So we would start by looking at the answer choices and determining if we have a verb type 1 question. Now, if this is your first time hearing from me about this topic, a verb type 1 question is a singular versus plural question. And there's a bit of a chink in the armor of the SAT test writers here. If they're asking a verb type 1 question in which they're testing between singular and plural varieties of the verb, the right answer will be the outlier. That is, you'll have 3 singular and the right answer will be plural. Or you'll have 3 plural and the right answer will be singular. So is this necessarily true on all SAT questions in the verb context? No. And it's not necessarily true, for any test in which they're testing singular or plural. If they were testing you on 2 facts at once, namely singular versus plural and verb tense, past, present, future, then of course you could have, some other combination of answer choices. But as of 2026, when the SAT asks you questions about singular or plural in verbs, they're really just asking you to pick the outlier. So let's test that first. Would you say one thing underlies or many things underlies? You could probably tell we're using our intuition here. One thing underlies. So that's singular. One thing is underlying, singular. Many things underline, plural. One thing has been underlying, singular. So a quick note about this that may be of surprise to you. We use S's for plural nouns, right? Tables, chairs, shirts. But we use S's for singular verbs. He runs, she walks, right? So it's just worth saying that out loud one time because we think about S's as indicating plurality, and that's true with nouns. It's not true with verbs. Okay, so I know that the answer is C, and it sounds like our friend in the Berkshires also knew that it was C, but they were, confused when they went back and tried to verify the subject. Okay, because they said the idea is singular, and indeed, the idea is a singular entity. So perhaps the problem here is that the idea is not the correct subject, right? It would make sense to say the idea underlies each emotional reaction in this sentence. That would make sense. However, let's see what actually underlie each emotional reaction. It must be the frameworks, okay? So look, there are 2 levels to this. The easy level is if you have a 3 in 1, pick the outlier. You could get this question right without thinking very hard. But for those students who are intellectually curious and wondering how in the world you choose between the idea as a subject for this sentence or the frameworks as the subject of the sentence, it all comes down to this little word that. Okay? The word that creates what's called a subordinating clause or a subordinate clause. You could call it a subordinating conjunction. So what does that mean? Well, basically, everything that follows the idea is just a description of the idea. And the subordinate clause, what follows the word that, could have been an independent clause in another context. So let's run our hey, guess what game. Hey, guess what? The various cultural and ideological frameworks a person has internalized underlie each emotional reaction. Fancy sentence. The various frameworks underlie each reaction. A more simplified version. That's a full sentence, right? So if you went back to the beginning of this clause, if you looked at the punctuation and you said, hey, look, there's this long dash after emotions and before the idea, that must be the subject. Most of the time that's correct. The words at the beginning of the clause are oftentimes the subject. However, the word that created a more complex sentence, right? So this goes back to the idea that we started our podcast with today. A little learning is a dangerous thing, right? If you learn a strategy, you have to choose to stick with it, damn the torpedoes, sort of to contravene your intuitions. You'll have to decide, I'm going to use the strategy even though my intuitions suggest I should pick something else. Or you have to go all the way with that learning and choose to go deeper into the grammar. For most of us, there's other things that you could employ your critical faculties on other than SAT grammar. And so I would highly recommend using the type 1 strategy, right? That is, see if you have a verb type 1, 3 singular and 1 plural, 3 plural and 1 singular, pick the outlier. But for those of us who are drawn into a deeper inquiry, the word that created the subordinating clause. Therefore, we had to go with the answer choice that matched the subject frameworks. Okay, hard stuff, I know. Let's continue. Okay. We have a transition question here on number 22. And this is a really important note. The student says they used the question 22 transition trick as a last-ditch resort. Here's what they're referring to. There are many, many times near the end of the section in which you'll see an answer choice that shows contrast, like however or nevertheless, and then you'll see an answer choice that shows cause and effect. And oftentimes, the sentence structure starts with one idea and ends with a contrasting idea, thereby suggesting that the contrast answer is correct. However, there will already have been contrast in that sentence. Therefore, the right answer will end up being cause and effect. Okay? So I had mentioned that to the student in order to prime them for a specific scenario that isn't extraordinarily high probability, but you might say 20 to 30% of the time, this is a thing, and to put a little meat on the bone there are a total of 8 official SAT practice tests. And on 3 of those, we see this strategy being deployed on question 21 or 22. Okay. So this is a, 3/8, which is, better than 30%, of course, a 3/8 proposition on the practice test. However, the student, I think, used the strategy incorrectly here, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Let's read this question over, and I'll talk to you about how to handle transition questions generally as well. Okay, so with transition questions, the most important thing to notice is the location of the transition and what that implies about which 2 pieces are to be considered. So let me be clear about that. Notice that our blank is in the middle of a sentence and each answer choice concludes with a comma. Well, that means that this transition is in the middle of this sentence. That would, for some people, suggest that the information directly before and directly after the transition are the 2 pieces to consider. That's not the case. The transitional word is still showing a relationship between the previous sentence and the current sentence. Okay, so we've got basically, I'll call this my orange sentence here since we've used some orange. And then I'll call the other sentence purple. And that purple sentence is right here. Our job is to understand the relationship between these 2 clauses. I'll read the information before the purple sentence because it's important to have enough context so that you can make a informed decision about the transitional word. Starting at the top, working together with the Navajo Nation Department of Water Resources, Dr. Lani T. analyzed data about snowpack levels in the Chuska Mountains. Okay, so we have some context. This person analyzed snowpack data. She found that the snowpack, the amount of snow on the ground, was deepest in early March at lower elevations. Okay, So we have a time period, early March, when the snow is deepest. Then we have a second sentence. At higher elevations, the snowpack was deepest in mid-March. So these two ideas are in direct contrast. I know it's tricky because they're both talking about March. They're both talking about the depth of the snowpack and that snowpack reaching its deepest levels. But we're comparing two different elevations, higher and lower. And we would have to say that that's a contrast. We only have one contrasting answer, and that's on the other hand, right? In summary, suggests that we're going to take the information previously provided, maybe in the first two sentences, and condense it into the most important point. For instance, it would be an example, and in other words would mean saying the same thing in different language, right? So none of those make sense here. And the reason I say that the student employed this method incorrectly is that there was no cause and effect answer. A cause and effect transition is like therefore, hence, then, in conclusion, right? These are the kind of phrases that suggest cause and effect. We have no such answer choice. So the very particular strategy that I had outlined, which is if given a cause and effect answer and given a contrast answer and giving contrasting information in the passage, be wary of the contrast answer in this location. I know that's hyper specific, okay? But if you're going for a top score, you're looking for points on the margins. And so I want you to be aware of this strategy, and perhaps I'll show you in another video what I mean about this particular strategy. I'm going to stick with the questions that my student is asking about here because this is the pod dedicated to the man himself. So we'll continue. One more thing I'll say actually about transition questions. You'll notice that I took each answer choice and I gave you sort of a definition of what each answer does. That's important. Be able to tell yourself what each answer functions as in the sentence, right? In other words means that we're going to say the same thing with different language. Be able to run that exercise for each type of transition if you want to have the most success you can in these types of questions. Onward. Let's do one more transition question, shall we? In this case, I think I'll show you the order in which I would typically do these questions. Let's start by level setting here, understanding what our answer choices even are. So we've already talked about in other words. In other words is going to mean we say the same thing with different language. That said is something like nevertheless, or it's some kind of a contrast. It's a very specific kind of contrast. The third one is for example, and the fourth one is accordingly. And accordingly is a cause and effect type of answer choice, right? Something happens and then you follow from that information in accordance with that information, right? So we do have a cause and effect answer here. We have some kind of a contrast here. And I think we're going to have this set up. I don't know for sure. I don't have these questions memorized, but I will tell you that this phrase, in retrospect, is starting to feel like that type of a thing. Okay. In retrospect, one of the lessons of the 2003 Human Genome Project is that a gene is affected by many factors, not the least of which is its interactions with the protein products in other genes. So, if that sounds fancy, simplify it for yourself. Looking back, there were many lessons, but one of them from this Human Genome Project is that there are factors including interactions with proteins, okay? Trying to keep that kind of simple. The next sentence, we're not going to put any of these blanks in yet. We're just going to evaluate the sentence in and of itself. So just for clarity, let's call this first one purple. We've said what the lesson of that question or that sentence was. Second sentence, I'll call green. Rather than just focusing on the human genome, efforts to better understand gene mutations related to disease have begun to consider the human proteome, the complete set of proteins expressed by the human genes. So this sounds like we're talking about the same idea. Basically, proteins matter, right? Proteins matter is what we're saying here. Okay. So the first sentence says, we learned a lesson, and that lesson is that the proteins matter. The second sentence says, the proteins matter, right? So based on what I've said so far, we're saying that these two sentences work together in some way. They're not saying something oppositional. They're saying something, that is in accordance with. And I think we could say accordingly, or in other words, are in the running. It's not an example because we don't get an example from the prior Human Genome Project or an example of the proteins interacting. What we get is further research, right? So it's not for example, and it's not the contrast answer that said. We're in between in other words or accordingly. And I love getting it down to two answers because it can help you clarify the distinctions you're making. Instead of just saying, it's one of these two, which one feels good? Instead, you can say, well, what's the difference between these two? There's something similar in as much as each of these answer choices suggests something other than contrast. In other words, would mean we're not going further. We're continuing to state the same point with different language. Accordingly would mean that we're saying something new based on the old information. So let's think about this. The purple sentence says that we have learned that the interactions with protein products affect the genome. The green sentence says we have begun efforts to understand, gene mutations with proteins. So that sounds like a next step, right? And for that reason, the best answer is accordingly, right? So this is an example of the strategy that I mentioned before, in as much as we're late in the test, right? We're module 2, number 25. We see an answer choice that shows contrast, that's that said, and we see an answer that shows cause and effect, and it ends up being right, okay? So the strategy is useful, but you have to practice these strategies in order to see real success. You have to see the edge cases. You have to see when to apply the strategies, right? And, if you can have one-on-one meetings with me, great. If you can watch, 20 hours of me talking at you over the internet, great. But I think the fastest way to do this is to use the app that's been designed on all of my work, right? So the 1600 game has a bunch of examples that I've tailor-made based on these questions that can help you understand the strategy at a granular level and then apply those strategies when you see them on the test. Okay, so there's transitions. If we have any more transitions questions, we'll push past them to move on to a different type here. We've got some math stuff, and I think I'll go for the math stuff as opposed to some of the reading stuff, just to stress a couple other of the low-hanging fruit. Remember, the reading questions, particularly reading comprehension questions and vocabulary, are the questions that are the hardest to improve upon in a short amount of time. Okay? Math is eminently beatable with good strategies. Grammar, transitions, command of evidence, bullet points, these are eminently beatable with good strategies. Certainly you can improve your vocabulary. Certainly you can improve your reading. But those two categories require heavier lifting, and the skills that you need to succeed at the highest level are more subtle, more nuanced. There are a myriad of complexities to those questions. So I would suggest focusing on grammar, verbs, transitions in the reading section, and then basically everything in the math section. We can get more specific about math here as we go. There may be some questions that I choose to skip for that reason. So here we are on number 17, okay? And this question asks in the last sentence, if C and D are positive constants, which equation could define F? Okay, so test awareness. You'll hear me say that over and over again. This is question 17. It's asking you about a line. You studied lines when you were in 7th grade. So why is this number 17 out of 22 on an SAT test, probably in Module 2. Could be Module 1, but why is it near the end of a section when these are the types of questions that are supposed to determine who goes to MIT and who doesn't? Why is a line that type of a question? If you can't find the trap, you're probably sitting in the trap, okay? This is what test awareness means. Know where you are, know what to expect, okay? It doesn't mean, by the way, that the question is hard. It means it's easy to get wrong. So keep in mind, it doesn't have to be hard. It's just easy to get wrong. I don't mean to tell you that this is some, super complex question. Only that it's something that if you don't take stock of its position, it could lull you to sleep and you could get it wrong, even though it's not, even though in some ways it's beneath you. Okay. So here's the trick. The graph they've shown you is not f of x. The graph is f of x plus 19. Well, what does that mean? Well, the y-intercept of f of x plus 19 is 3. So that means the graph has already been, the function f has been shifted up 19 units, and the y-intercept is still only at positive 3, indicating that the y-intercept of the original function is 19 spots lower than 3 at negative 16. Okay, well, there's one other thing to consider. The answer choices do not show the standard y equals mx plus b, or just as good, f of x in this case equals mx plus b. Most of you folks will be familiar, particularly my students in the United States, with the slope-intercept form. Students in Europe seem to use the standard form more. But in slope-intercept form, m is slope, b is y-intercept. Here you'll notice that the one that has an x term is not first but second. It's a small thing, but it's something that will make some folks stumble. So the b term in slope-intercept would definitely be a negative number. You'd have some slope that should be negative. Sorry for my bad handwriting. And then you should have some intercept that should be negative. In other words, both in the parlance of this question, C and D should both be negative. Okay. So there we have it. Answer choice A, which shows us a negative intercept in the form of D and a negative slope in the form of C. If you're unclear about the slope piece, just notice that as x grows bigger and bigger, that is more positive, the y values decrease. That is the definition of a negative slope. As x grows more positive, y grows more negative. That is a negative slope. And it looks like our friend in the mountains of Massachusetts made the mistake of selecting according to the y-intercept of 3. Okay, so if a brilliant person can make this mistake, then so can you. And if you are said brilliant person, take stock of this mistake. Test awareness is the big thing here. Where are you and what do you expect? Number 17, something that seems rather elementary. It is, although there is some way in which the question has been made, convenient for mistakes, shall we say, right? So there we have it on number 17. Let's see what else we have. Yes. Okay. This question asks, you'll notice that on math questions, I go to the last sentence first. I want to know what the ask is. I want to know what the question is before I take in any new information. The order in which you take in information is extremely important for your efficiency and your bandwidth on a question. If you let your mind be flooded with other information, it's harder to assess what's necessary, and sometimes you'll end up doubling back and reading something twice. If you go to the last sentence first and you know particularly what you've been asked, then you can take steps to integrate the rest of the information accordingly. So the last sentence first, what is the area in square units of the triangle ADE? The first thing I'm going to do is clarify which triangle I'm talking about, endpoints ADE, otherwise known as the big triangle. Okay? If this were a multiple choice question, I would look out for the mistake that says, since the equation for the area of a triangle is 1/2 base times height, I would look out for just base times height. In other words, if there was an answer that were twice as big as another answer, I would flag that as a potential trap. No answer choices here, so we don't have to worry about that. Here we have some information, which I will put into my figure right away. Root 34 is AB. AC is 3. And CE, here's the trap, is 21. Okay, so these triangles are proportionate, but you'll notice what they didn't tell you, the more useful information, is that AE is 24. The proportion of these triangles, let's call them orange, and we'll call the big triangle red. The proportion of these triangles is 8. That is to say, AC, I'll write these triangles separately so you can see them. Pardon my poor drawings here. We have orange and we have red. And we have the corresponding sides in the proportion 3 and 24. So just to be clear, this angle here at A, let's call it theta, is shared by both triangles. They also have a 90-degree angle. That implies that the third angle is also the same. Okay, since all triangles add up to 180, and since 2 of the 3 angles have been already determined to be equivalent, we therefore know that the third angle is equivalent. If you're confused at all, this in the 1600 game, there's a whole course called the Geometer. And the Geometer is a series of videos in which I explain all the foundational information that you may have forgotten about geometry. It's a good reminder of all of that stuff. And also work through some SAT particular geometry questions. So a good resource if this is feeling a little rusty for you. Nonetheless, we'll continue. The fact is, the test makers have queued up a misunderstanding by giving you the length CE, which is not the entire length of 24, but the partial length CE of 21. That would suggest that the ratio of the sides is, or the ratio of the triangles is 7-1. 3 to 21 is the same as 1 to 7, right? 21 is 7 times bigger. 24 is 8 times bigger, right? So what do we have left to do? Well, I think I can see the mistake that our friend made. On the orange triangle, this is the square root of 34. The mistake that many people will make, I'm not sure if this is part of our friend's mistake or the entirety of it, would be to misplace the scale factor here. 8 times bigger than root 34 goes like this, right? 8 times bigger than root 34. Some people will make the mistake of multiplying 34 times 8 and then taking the square root, although I'm not sure that would comport with this answer choice. Okay, so the area of ADE, the large triangle, now I see it. Perhaps that student multiplied these together as if these were the base and the height. What we need to do is we need to figure out this third side here, which I'll call x, and we can do that by Pythagorean theorem. 24 squared plus x squared is equal to 8 rad 34 squared, quantity squared. Okay, so 24 squared is, top of my head, 144 times 4 plus x squared, and that's going to equal 64 times 34. From there, you can do the math yourself to figure out what x is. Once you know what x is, you can then calculate the area using 1/2 base times height. I'm sorry to leave you hanging with that information, but consider that your homework assignment. Your other homework assignment is to get a free trial at the 1600 game. 7 days free. You can deal with all of these questions and more. You can have access to many of my materials, the courses. You can have access to the AI Mastermind tutor. Along with those materials, you also have an AI tutor that will teach you in small increments how to work through each and every question on the app. At the very least, the mastermind will give you a study plan that you can apply to all your work on College Board and Khan Academy, as well as on our app, which we think is the highest value thing you can do. But those 2 homework assignments: finish this question, solve for x, and then call x your height, call 24 your base. Make sure to divide by 2. And then get the 1600 game. Thank you guys for joining us. Next time we'll be back with one of our brilliant tutors. And until then, happy studying. Take care.